concept of building an interview strategy, because many people kind of like don't think about that. And part of the message I'm going to be trying to convey to you is you should put storytelling at the center of your interview strategy. Second, I want to talk about the power of storytelling. So why stories are so powerful, but also what are the ingredients that make stories powerful. Okay. Third, building on the metaphor of cooking, since I was talking about ingredients, I want to talk about this one kind of story that tell me about yourself, and I'm going to share 5 recipes for you for how to think about the tell me about yourself. And fourth, if it comes up, yes, there we go. Whoops. I want to talk about the other kind of story, which is the story, tell me about a time when you did X, Y, Z. And here I'm going to share with you one recipe, because that's really all you need. And then we will wrap it up. So before we get started with the first item, let me just kind of like, there is a couple of things I want to say. That, it turns out that a lot of candidates, like a lot of interviews, it kind of feels like it's 2 robots talking to each other. The candidate is a robot, the interviewer is a robot. But really, if you think about it, first of all, that's not fun. But also, like at the end of the day, it turns out, the candidate is a human being, and so is the interviewer. Truly, I swear to you, they're human beings. And so how can we humanize that whole process again? Okay, we really want to do this because this is what's going to make your interview different and stand out from other interviews, is if you're able to humanize that. Now, I've also noticed over the years interviewing many candidates that a lot of candidates kind of like essentially in the interview, they kind of like they're interviewing with the handbrake on. So in other words, they're afraid of making mistakes, they're afraid of disappointing, they're afraid of being judged, etc. Right? And so in order to avoid making mistakes, they drive with the handbrake on. But what I realized, again, interviewing over many candidates, is that the interviews that go really well is when the candidates release the handbrake and give themselves permission to show the best of themselves. It can be a little bit scary, but at the same time, it's when you really give yourself the permission to do that, to show yourself in a great light, without selling yourself, that you do really great. So hopefully I'm hoping to kind of share some ways of storytelling that can help you to do that. Okay, but let's start with building an interview strategy. I love pictures. I like to start by looking at this picture. I think you probably all recognize what the heck this picture is. It's an electric chair. But why am I showing an electric chair? I'm showing it because what I realized is, it was also my own experience as a candidate, is that a lot of people approach the whole interview from a place of fear. They kind of expect that the interview is going to be something unpleasant, something where they're judged, something where every question kind of hurts, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But what's kind of interesting about this is that really underpinning this, there's kind of like a mindset of almost a victim mindset. So what I mean by this is it's a mindset where basically the interview happens to you. The interviewer does things to you. But what I noticed is that actually the candidates who did really well in interviews, they actually had a completely different mindset. What they did is they turned this around 180 degrees. And instead of asking themselves, what will happen to me in the interview? What will the interviewer do to me? They ask themselves the following question: how can I make the interview work for me? How can I shape this interview? Really, how can I take control or at least become the protagonist of this interview? Okay, that's a fundamentally different sort of approach. And if you take this kind of approach, like I'm going to be the protagonist of this thing, then it makes sense to be strategic about the way that you approach the interview. And being strategic, what does it mean? Well, a strategy is what? It's a combination of a goal or a set of goals, and then the plan to get there. So when we talk about interview strategy, we need to define our objectives. What do we want to achieve in this interview? Build a game plan. That's the interview itself. And of course, this is where we learn a little bit from the military. We need to practice the execution so that on the day that it counts, we can really execute properly. So let me talk a little bit more about objectives and game plan. What are the objectives? What should be our objectives when interviewing? Well, a lot of people kind of think the objectives should be to get the job. I say, okay, on some level that makes sense. However, it actually is not really a helpful way to think about it like this. Why? Because first of all, it's very unlikely that your job will depend on one single interview. Usually you need to do a couple of rounds of interviews, but in total, at least 2, if not 3 or 4 or 5 interviews to get the offer. So you can't, it doesn't make sense to say, my objective for this interview is to get the job, right? But there's another reason why it doesn't really make sense, is that you don't actually have complete control over whether you get the offer or not. There's a lot of other things that are completely outside your control. You can't control the quality of the other candidates. You can't control whether the company decides in the end not to hire anybody. There's a lot of things you can't control. So I think it makes a lot more sense to define the objectives in terms of what you can control. And what you can control is to essentially the overall idea of trying to establish or prove or demonstrate that there is a fit between you and the job and the company. That you can control. Okay, so how do we demonstrate that there is a fit between me, you, and the job and the company? Well, this is where I like to think like Mike, M-I-C. What is that? Well, Mike, M, stands for messages. So in other words, hello? Yes. What are the messages that you want to convey to the interviewer? Or put another way, what is it that you want the interviewer to know about you by the time the interview is over? Okay, you can control that. Okay, so that's going to be mostly a function of the things that you say. And what are these messages going to be about? They're going to be about your skills. Right? They're going to be about what motivates you, what your aspirations are. And they might even be also about what your values are, to the extent that you feel it's valuable to demonstrate that there's a values fit between you and the company. Okay, so that's one. What is it that you want the interviewer to know about you? And that's a function of, and that determines the messages you want to convey. Good, but there's more to it. The I stands for impressions. So the impressions are the result of how you talk and how you act. Okay, that also you control. So what are the things to think about here? Well, partially your communication. So do you come across as articulate? Partially the kind of attitude that you convey. So for example, do you want to show that you're somebody who is optimistic, who believes in the future, and so on, who's kind of who has a sense of excitement, or somebody who's more pessimistic and sees the world in a dark light, etc. But what is the kind of attitude that you want to demonstrate? And more broadly, what are the elements of the great elements of your personality that you want to demonstrate and that you want them to experience? And you might have heard kind of the holy grail here is probably what a lot of recruiters talk about is a lot of them say, oh, you should be yourself in the interview. And probably you think, oh my God, what does that mean? And that feels very not actionable. But actually, now that I've been in an interview so many times, I can tell you this is exactly what we want. We want people to be themselves, a good version of themselves, not the hungover version of themselves, but a good version of yourself. So what I'm going to show you is what that means and how to achieve it. But you need to be a little bit patient for that. Okay, so we want to show, in terms of our objectives, there's a few things about the interviewer that we want the interviewer to know about us. And there's a few things that we want the interviewer to see and experience about us, the impressions. So what's the last bit? Well, remember, the interviewer is a person, yeah? And people love to connect. So can you actually foster connection during the interview? Can you give connection a chance? You can't force connection, but can you give connection a chance? And that's going to be a function of how you interact. But think about it for a moment. Maybe some of you have already had interviews where you really connected with the interviewer, and that just feels completely different, right? So how do we achieve that? Through how we interact. And partly it's about being friendly, that helps a lot. Partly it's about opening up. And partly it's about showing interest in the interviewer himself or herself. Okay, so imagine if you, as you prepare for an interview, you develop your objectives along these lines, and even better, imagine if you achieve them. How awesome would that be? Okay, so in order to achieve this, we need a game plan. The game plan is the interview itself. And I like to divide the interview into 3 parts: the beginning, the middle, and the end. So in the beginning, you are going to be introducing yourself, answering the question, tell me about yourself, or walk me through your CV, or something like this. We're going to talk about this later. As I said, I'm going to share 5 recipes with you, so I don't want to spend too much time on it right now, but let's just say at this stage that this part really matters. But we'll talk about it, don't worry. Now, let's get to the middle. Remember that there are some messages we want to convey about our skills, right? About our motivations. So what's the best way to convey a message, to convey the message that I have great leadership skills? Should I just say to the interviewer, trust me, I'm a great leader? Yeah, that's probably not going to work, right? So we want a different approach. What we need to share examples that illustrate how we are great leaders, or how we're great creative problem solvers, or how we are resilient, or whatever it is, right? We need examples. And even better, we want to tell these examples in the form of stories. Why stories? Well, stories are, first of all, memorable. Well-told stories are remembered. Check this. People remember well-told stories 22 times more than just collections of facts. Okay, so if you want to be remembered, tell great stories. But great stories are also great because they're engaging, right? They keep the attention. Stories are great because they're relatable, yeah? So when they're relatable, they foster the possibility of connection, okay? So there's a lot of good reasons to tell stories. And in fact, that's actually kind of like my main message, is that what you want to do is you want to put stories at the center of your interview plan. So you have a great story at the beginning, and then you have these stories, which are basically the tell me about a time when stories. So if the interview is kind of like the engine that ultimately powers you, or one of the engines that powers you to a job offer, then the stories are the cylinders that power this interview, okay? All right. Let me tell you, let me share a little bit more. Because, when we go to the end, most people think, oh, at the end, it's the time for me to ask questions. Well, let me offer a contrarian view here. I'm going to assume that you're going to ask good questions, okay? Because bad questions are not very helpful. So if you're going to ask good questions, do you really want to wait until the end? I would say it's even better if you ask your questions during the interview. Because if you ask good questions during the interview, and good questions include questions about the interviewer, what made them decide to join the company, what their experience was, how it's been, similar to what they expected, but also different from what they expected. But if you ask these questions, not only you show interest in the interviewer, so that fosters connection, but in addition, you create the possibility for this interview to turn into a conversation away from interrogation. Okay, so you want to be clever, differentiate yourself, and make the interview that much stronger. Start asking your questions during the interview. Okay, but then what do we do at the end? Well, what do we do at the end? Okay, we say goodbye, yeah. But before, we talk about next steps, yeah. But do we do anything before? Well, here's what I noticed the great candidates do. What they do, even though the interviewer doesn't ask them to do that, but they take initiative, is they actually wrap up the interview with a summary of why they believe there's a strong fit between themselves and the company and the job. And the summary of that fit is really essentially structured into why they really want this and why they believe they can do well, like the value that they can bring to the table. And where do these sort of arguments come from? Well, what they really are is they're the consequence or the conclusion of all the stories that you've told. So when you kind of like summarize at the end like this, then basically all of the stories that you told now sort of crystallize into a clean, synthetic, compelling picture that kind of reinforces what you've been saying before, and that really leaves a memorable mark. Okay. So that's a little bit my little spiel on approaching the interview as a protagonist rather than someone to whom the interview is going to happen, and being strategic about how to approach it. And one of the key messages is put storytelling at the center of the interview. So let's deep dive a little bit more into the power of storytelling. There are many, many reasons why stories are so great. Good stories, not bad stories, but good stories. One, as I mentioned before, they're relatable. That creates a basis for connection, which is great. In every story, this is kind of the magic of stories. Every story has a combination of something that is unique, so the story that happened to you 2 weeks ago, it didn't happen to anybody else. So there's something always unique about that, which helps to differentiate you. But there's always also something universal in every story. The nature of the experience, there's something universal and relatable, right? And that can help to foster connection. Great stories are memorable, as I mentioned before. By the way, this number, I didn't make it up. It comes from research at Stanford. Great stories are engaging. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Great stories are simple and powerful at the same time. I will show you what I mean by that. And lastly, I believe that great stories can be the ticket to be yourself. So we'll get there. So I think you naturally understand the concept of great stories being relatable and memorable. So I don't think we need to spend much more time on this, but let me talk a little bit about the engaging bit. So there's this very interesting question, which is what percent of time are interviewers actually listening to the candidate when the candidate is talking? And you might think, well, really, hopefully it's 100 or 90. But when you actually ask the interviewers, they give you a very different picture. What they say through the surveys is that they spend about 1/4 of the time actually listening to what the candidate is saying. 1/4. Actually, I bet it's even less, and that they just kind of felt a little bit embarrassed by how low the number is, so they inflated it. Okay. 1/4, right? So that means 3/4 of the time they're not listening. That means 3/4 of the time you have no chance of making an impact. Okay, so how do we think about this? Well, we can blame the interviewers for being unprofessional, but blaming never helps. It really never helps. Or we can adopt, instead of a victim mindset, oh no, I'm facing bad interviewers. We can again be a protagonist and ask ourselves, is there anything I can do to change this 25% to 75%? And the answer is yes, you can. Like Barack Obama would say, yes, we can. Okay, so what do we do? Well, I think what's important to recognize is that one of the key reasons that interviewers stop listening, that they tune out, is because candidates are, the things that they say and the way they talk about them is kind of boring. And mostly, what candidates do, is they focus on facts and logic. And people understand facts and logic, but it's just not exciting. It's just not exciting, okay? In fact, it gets worse. To process facts and logic, you need to use your neocortex, your thinking brain. In other words, that feels like work. And people don't like to work. People prefer to just, like at the cinema, you don't work. You just kind of like imbibe, absorb. But they don't like to have to think during the interview. Even worse, if a candidate kind of gives facts and logics, but in a disorganized way, it creates chaos in people's minds. And so when there's chaos, definitely they tune out. The point is that most candidates, what they do is it's unconscious, but de facto what they're doing is they're only speaking to the rational brain. And the rational brain actually doesn't like to work. The rational brain likes to sleep most of the time. Yeah, it's very rare that you actually spend 5 minutes straight thinking, truly. The only time that you really do this is probably during in-class exams. But otherwise, I mean, look, think about it. When you're doing your homework, how often do you allow yourself to get distracted by Messenger or Facebook or whatever, right? Your brain wants to shut off because it feels like work. So what is the stuff that actually keeps people awake? What is the stuff that moves people? What is the stuff that inspires people? It's very human stuff. Actually, it's also animal stuff. Human emotions, purpose. Yeah? Let me show you. Look at these kids. Amazing, right? Look at these smiles. They're so cute and adorable. But also it's kind of like there's something about them, like something in their face. We don't know what they're looking at, but there's something in their face where you're like, oh, it's so awesome that they see something that to them is magical, right? They're mesmerized, and that's awesome. I love it. Or look at this kid. It's actually, on the one hand, this kid is like really unhappy, but at the same time, he's so cute and adorable, and then you feel really bad for the kid. But the point is, right now we're feeling emotion as we look at these pictures, but it doesn't feel like work. It's engaging us. Or think about inspirational speeches, yeah? When we talk about values and purpose, that keeps people engaged, and it doesn't feel like work. So the point is, we want to speak not just to the rational brain, but we want to speak to the limbic system, the part that includes emotions, and stories do that. Let me show you from a brain scan perspective. This is a brain that's listening to pure logic. You can see the red and yellow. These are the areas of the brain that are being stimulated. Want to see what happens when somebody's listening to a good story? Right? It's a completely transformative experience. Yeah. What's happening here is that there's a series of hormones that are being produced, oxytocin, cortisol, and so on. So you as the candidate, you as the storyteller, you have the power to release those chemicals, those hormones in the interviewer's brain and create a real experience for them. Okay? So one of the key ingredients to be so message is, let's try to be engaging during the interview. That's really key. So to change the 25% to the 75%. And one of the key ingredients is stories, but stories with emotion. This is one of the ingredients. All right. We talked about using stories to make them to be engaging during the interview. Another huge benefit of great stories is that they're simple yet powerful. Let me give you an example. This guy was a lawyer in the US a long time ago. And one of the things that sort of made him famous is that basically people said he's kind of like the originator or the father of storytelling in the courtroom. Okay, so why is that? Well, he once had a client who had lost both of his arms in an industrial accident. And when it came, so they decided to sue the employer. And when it came time to do the closing arguments, instead of actually making a logical argument, he told a story. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you that story. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment just so that you can see a little bit more. And this is the story that he told. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, about an hour ago, we took our break for lunch. All of you members of the jury, you got up, you left the courtroom together, and you went back to your jury room and you had lunch. The judge and the court clerk, they got up together, left the courtroom, and they went to go have lunch. Opposing counsel, Mr. Horowitz over there, he and his clients got up, left the courtroom, and went to go have lunch. So I turned to my client, Harold, and I said, why don't you and I go have lunch? And that's exactly what we did. We went across the street to that little restaurant over there, and we had lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, I just had lunch with my client. He doesn't have any arms, so he has to eat like a dog. Thank you very much. And that was his story. That was his story. So, what's going on here? Well, probably a couple things. One, notice how there's some vividness to it, right? You probably visualize like the courtroom and different kinds of people getting up and leaving, etc. So there's something very vivid, right? You kind of get immersed in it. Beyond that, you probably also experienced a combination of empathy and sympathy for this Harold guy, right? Like you probably realized, oh my goodness, like what it's like to not have arms, and the only way that you can eat is basically bend your waist and put your face in the food, and how humiliating that must be because you're eating like an animal. So on the one hand, it's an incredibly simple story because it's just a story about people having lunch. It doesn't get simpler than that. But at the same time, it's an incredibly powerful story. The meaning of the story is really powerful. Why? Because it's clear that like this guy's life is never going to be the same again. It's fundamentally changed. And the clear message is, the jury should vote for him and give him huge damages because of what, happened in this accident. Simple, yet powerful. There's a very nice perspective on this, by the way, how, stories is about creating meaning out of information. This is how Lego thinks about it. Lego recently went into, or like a couple of years ago, started like working with big data. And, this is a little bit how they make sense of, storytelling. Anyway, so this gives us extra ingredients to make stories great. Great stories are simple and coherent. Yeah. So simple, it should be clear why they're simple, because simple, if they're complicated, people start tuning out. So you want them simple. But coherent, what that means, it's that all the irrelevant details, even if they're true, you keep them out. That's really important. People have a tendency to want to put way too much stuff in their stories. Take out all the stuff that, even though it's true, we don't need to know. Great stories raise the stakes. So in other words, there's some kind of drama in there. There's some kind of like unresolved issue in a story. Somebody struggling or somebody facing an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that's difficult to grab, right? But they raise the stakes. This is what keeps attention. And there's a vividness to great stories as well. Good. So we just saw, and great stories that end with a rush of insight. What does that mean? It means that it's a little bit like the punchline of a joke. A great story, one of the things that can make stories great is that when everything becomes clear at the end, right? And so when the guy says he has to eat like a dog, all of a sudden everything becomes clear. Yeah. And the reason rushes of insight are so powerful is because the listener, the moment they get it, they feel really smart. They feel like they learned. They feel like, they see the world in a way that they didn't before. And that makes them feel good about themselves. That's the part of the oxytocin that you release. Okay, so I will show you in the recipes, like a lot of the recipes that I'm going to share with you end with a rush of insight, and I'm going to share some examples with you. Okay, last point, being yourself. So let me actually start with a story which works as a bit of a metaphor. I don't know if any of you have ever been on a safari before, or maybe I actually went on one a couple months ago. But if you haven't, maybe you went scuba diving. And here's a little bit what happens in a safari. And by the way, the reason I'm telling you this story is because it's a metaphor for the experience of the interviewer. So what happens when you go on a safari? So let's say you go on a safari holiday, right? For a few days. When you first get in the Jeep for the first few hours of the game drive, you're super excited. And then the moment you see your first gazelle or your first zebra, you're like, oh, look, zebra, gazelle, right? You're super, super excited. Of course, because you don't see them roaming around Écully or Lyon or wherever you come from, right? Great. And then what you notice is it's a bit the same thing with scuba diving, right? At first you see all the beautiful coral and you see the angelfish and the parrotfish, and it's beautiful and it's awesome, etc. But then what happens is you kind of quickly realize that we become blasé very quickly. And after 2 hours of seeing gazelles and zebras, it's like, okay, here's another gazelle, here's another zebra. Okay, I've seen the coral. And you start craving for something else. You start craving for something really rare, exotic, awesome, that will sweep you off your feet. Like this. So, that's exactly the experience of interviewers. Most of the candidates that they meet, they're kind of like gazelles. They might be very well prepared, very competent, but at the same time, kind of like, in the end, kind of, boring. But then occasionally, there's this one candidate that shows up, and they're like, oh, wow, so awesome. Not because they have so much of a better CV, but because of the way that the stories they tell, the way that they engage, and so on. And what's really happening in those cases is that the candidate actually is being themselves. Yeah? So they're being themselves, a great version of themselves. So what does that mean to be yourself? Well, it's helpful to think about it in terms of what it's not. So what it's not is you're not being yourself when you're trying to be someone else. That's for sure. So don't do that, because people know this right away. You're also not being yourself so let's say most of the time when people are not being themselves, it's not because they're trying to be someone else, but it's actually something else is going on. Most of the time it's because they are not allowing themselves to be themselves. Constrained. And so I actually believe that storytelling can solve this. Let me give you an example. I'm going to give you two stories. My story, twice, two different versions. The one story, which is the very classical story, and it's kind of like a boring story. And the second version, which is a much more being myself, authentic story, and hopefully that'll work better for you. Let's imagine that I'm applying for a teaching role at EM Lyon. And the dean interviews me and says, Nicholas, tell me about yourself. And so what I might say, using a very classical story, I might say, well, my name is Nicholas. I was born in Paris. I studied, so in university, I studied mathematics and political science. And after university, I started working in business. So I joined the airline industry, where my first job in the industry was great. I was working in network development. So basically figuring out where to fly with what kind of planes. And then I took a second job within the industry where I worked on revenue management. And I really liked the airline industry. But at some point I thought that I wanted to kind of build my skills some more. So I decided to go do an MBA. So I did my MBA at Chicago, University of Chicago. And afterwards I went into consulting at McKinsey, where I spent 8 years, first focusing on corporate finance and then doing operations, focusing on operations. And then after McKinsey, I left, and then I joined KPMG as the partner to basically build a team of operations consultants, blah, 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 blah. And I think this story is incredibly boring. It's boring. It's boring. Why it's boring? Because it's like, it's boring in substance and it's boring in form. The thing is, there's so many people who have exactly the same path that I do. You can change the names, but it's the same stuff, right? So that's boring. And it's boring in the way that I tell it, because all I'm doing is just kind of giving like I'm kind of saying this happened and then this happened and then this happened, etc. So everything that I said is true, but it's just boring. Okay, let me try again with a more authentic version. So let's say the dean is asking me, Nicholas, tell me about yourself. And what I might say is the following. I might say, well, listen, I think I was always destined to become a teacher, but it actually took me quite a while to realize it. When I was in university, one of the things I did to earn a little bit of pocket money was actually to tutor high school kids in math, because I was a math major. And what I realized pretty quickly is that I was actually really good at tutoring them, and I really enjoyed it. And the reason I was good is because I actually loved math. And my passion for math was kind of contagious. They started loving math, and from the moment they started loving math, they started to actually care about it and improve. And I found that really rewarding, but I didn't make anything of it at the time. Fast forward 6 years, I'm in business school, second year student, MBA student, and exactly the same thing happens with case interviews when I'm coaching first years. I realize I'm very good. I realize I really enjoy it. And the reason is because I love the whole intellectual process of case interviews. And my passion for it, or my love of it, kind of becomes contagious for the coachees, and they start to become excited and so on. Again, I didn't make anything of it at the time, but it was definitely a repeat. Fast forward a few years, I'm at McKinsey. And one of the things, that next to my client work I love to do is delivering trainings. And the reason I love delivering trainings is because, again, I'm passionate about the content. I realize that people like it, and they like it because I'm good at doing the trainings. And the reason I'm good at doing the trainings is because, again, I really believe in the content. Right. So again, this virtuous cycle takes place. And so, now that I've spent about 15 years in industry and consulting, I believe I have a lot of very meaningful content to share with business students that can complement the academic curriculum. And this is why I'm excited at the prospect of becoming a teacher here. You see, everything that I said is true again, but it's a completely different story. It's a story that is much more authentic because the things that I'm talking about, I actually care. Okay? They're meaningful to me. And so because I'm talking about things that I care, I come to life. I share with them, I talk about them in a much more committed way. And as a result, really, it's kind of like the best version of myself is coming out, because what I'm talking about are the things that matter to me, and the form, the way in which I'm doing it is kind of like with much more emotion and commitment and so on, right? So here's a little bit the message that I want to share with you, is that if you want to be yourself, not the drunk version, but the best version, if you want to be liked and remembered, if you want to connect with people and earn their trust, and in the end, even if you want to influence people, tell great stories that matter to you. So the stories that you tell, they should be stories that you're ready to sort of defend, stand by, that you're excited to tell because there's something in it that matters to you. Okay? Don't tell the story simply because it's true. Tell it because you value it. Okay. Hopefully you also saw through this example that there are so many already, I told you 3 versions of my story already. One of them was the classical one. The other 2 were completely different and probably more effective. Good. By the way, I want to share some piece of results. Interviewers have always known intuitively that people who are themselves perform better. Research from Harvard that just came out this year finally proves it. You can see here, catering basically means telling the other side what we think they want to hear. For example, trying to impress. It turns out that people perform much better in interviews when they're being themselves. But this was also tested in other high-stress situations. For example, investor pitches and networking. And part of the reason for this is because when you're trying to be yourself, it lowers anxiety. When you're trying to impress or tell the other side what you think they want to hear, it raises anxiety. And it raises anxiety to a point where we start to become constrained and make, we no longer shine, and we might even make some clumsy mistakes. So that's where this is coming from. So anyway, back to our ingredients. Tell stories that are meaningful to you. That's probably the most important ingredient if you want your stories to be great. Of course, you should also make sure that the story is relevant to your audience. So if you're applying for a job and you're telling a story about, I don't know, how one day you kind of like, painted a boat to make it look really nice, it might be interesting, it might matter to you, but it's probably not relevant, right? So make sure that it's relevant to your audience. And then great stories often have some perspective about the future that looks good. Yeah. In Netflix, it's not always true in Netflix. It's not always true in books. You can have books and movies, etc., that finish badly. That's totally cool. But in an interview, you want stories that like offer a good perspective, because you want to finish on a high, so that like, you want to be thinking about a little bit the emotional journey that you take your interviewer through. So when we put it all together, it gives us 8 ingredients that make stories really powerful. And so my tip to you is, as you craft your stories, try to inject bit by bit more and more and more of these ingredients. And the more you're able to inject these ingredients, the stronger your stories will be. Okay. But let's start doing some cooking now. Let's look at a few recipes. So remember, at the top of our interview strategy, there's the tell me about yourself. And this is by far the most important story you will tell. Basically, there's a lot of research that shows that like interviewers make up their mind, or most of their mind is made up in the first 5 minutes of the interview. And the reason for this is because of confirmation bias. And again, because the brain is lazy and so on and so forth. So it really pays to over-invest in making this story great. And if you make this story great, not only the interviewer will get excited about you, but you will know that you started great. In fact, you will be excited to show up and start telling that story because you know you have a great story. So it really pays to over-invest in making this story great. Let me also just say the following, is that like the objective with the tell me about yourself, what you want to achieve with it is you want to set the right energy tone. What you want to achieve with it is establish relevance. So in some way or form, make it clear why you're here. Create a content frame. So the frame through which we're going to be interpreting everything else that you say, and trigger interest and curiosity. The goal is not to give a complete account of your trajectory and everything you've done. That's not the goal. The goal is not to explain everything. In fact, it's better to leave some areas with question marks so that you trigger interest and curiosity. And the goal is not to sell yourself. Let the story do the talking. Don't try to sell yourself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you 5 different recipes for tell me about yourself. Okay? 5 different ways of thinking about this. I'm going to give you examples for all, and then I'll share the recipe. So let me start with the first one. This is a great story. I really love Jamie's story. And so imagine the interviewer. This is a story from like my airline days. And so imagine the interviewer saying, "Tell me about yourself." And basically, the person said, Jamie, who's a friend of mine, basically said the following. He said, "Well, I think I should start out by saying that, I kind of caught the airplane bug at age 7, and this has profoundly shaped my personal and professional decisions. I flew for the first time at the age of 7, And I remember being completely mesmerized by all the planes at the airport and my first flight experience. At the time, I couldn't really say much more than, wow, it's awesome. But in retrospect, I think I was really in awe of the power and the elegance of these machines. So on the one hand, when they're on the ground, they're very clumsy and difficult to maneuver. But once they're on the air, they're so powerful and they're so elegant. I mean, this really spoke to me. And my passion was so strong that eventually, by the time I became a teenager, I really begged my parents to let me get a pilot's license. And they accepted. And it was great. What an amazing feeling it was to be able to sort of command such a big and powerful and beautiful machine. But as much as I loved flying, I realized I didn't want to become a pilot for my career, because I thought that this would be a little bit too monotonic and too repetitive for a career. Over the years, my passion for planes had actually evolved into a passion for airlines. And so I decided that I wanted a career like in or around the airline industry, from the business side of things, to make a real difference. And this in turn impacted my decision of what to study. Since airlines actually struggle so much to be profitable, probably more than any other industry, I decided to get a degree in business with a focus in finance. And for my first internship, I wanted to kind of leverage my finance background. So I decided to apply for roles in equity research in the airline side of things. And I joined Sam Buttrick's team, which was a great honor because Sam is such a legend in the industry. And I absolutely loved my internship. I learned so much about airlines, about airline finance, about how to analyze their performance. Like every day was a real simulation, and I really, really loved it. The only slight blemish, the only little thing that I didn't quite like, was that in equity research, really most of what we do is we comment, but we don't make managerial decisions. And so now, as I'm thinking about what I want for my first job, I want to continue building my airline experience. I want to keep building my skills in applied finance, and I want to play a part in managerial decision-making. And this is why I'm applying to this role in the aircraft acquisition team at your airline. Yeah. So that was the story. And hopefully you also believe that it's differentiated and different and refreshing, and that there's a coherence about it, and that there's something kind of authentic about it. But I think it's a wonderful, wonderful story that actually really works and kind of triggers interest. But what's maybe more useful for you is what is kind of like the underlying framework in this story. And this is where recipe number 1 comes from. Basically, there's an underlying framework. I call it the chronological story, but it's actually more than a chronology. But essentially, there's 5 parts to it. The first part, there's an attention grabber. So, Jamie, instead of saying, my name is Jamie, which is super boring, he kind of says, well, I should start out by saying. So that already attracts attention. And then what he says is, I caught the airplane bug at age 7, and this has profoundly shaped, personal and professional decisions. So basically, he planted the stakes and says, this is what defines me. Okay, I'm listening. So then what he does is he puts some real substance to it, and he does it in a chronological manner, but in a nice, cleanly structured manner. Essentially 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So in his case, phase 1 was the childhood and teenage years when he got the pilot's license. Phase 2 was his studies, and phase 3 was the internship. Yeah? Now, somewhere along the way, he also started to talk about the future. He said he wanted a career in airline management, right? So he actually started talking about it like around here. But there is an element in that story about talking about your vision and aspiration. And at the end, he finishes in a very clear manner with a nice rush of insight. And the rush of insight is, that like now he wants to play a part in airline managerial decision making, and this is why he's applying for this particular role in the airline. Okay, and so now everything comes together and it becomes super clear why he wants this particular job. So I think it's a very, very elegant, very nice way of potentially thinking about how to craft your story. I could also imagine that you think, I don't know, I don't know I don't know if there is something that defines me so clearly as Jamie. And so if that's the case, that's fine, don't worry. For other recipes you can consider. So let me give you the second recipe. And the thing is that the second recipe looks very, very similar. Very similar. The only thing is what we change is instead of going through chronology, we go into themes. So what's happening here is that instead of being defined by this one thing, you're actually defined by three things, which you describe here, and then you go into the detail of each one. Let me give you an example, just so that you see how that works. So this is somebody that I met at KPMG. So the question was, tell me about yourself. And so, although actually, like I asked him, tell me about yourself when I met him, but it was not in the context of an interview. But I thought his story worked really well, even for an interview. And it kind of goes something like this. So basically, Eric, there's three things that define him. He's a community builder. He's passionate about technology, and he's a creative. So the community building came from essentially his childhood. His parents divorced when he was young, and his mom moved pretty far away. And every 2 years, his parents would decide that he should go live with the other parent. And so that meant that every 2 years, he was plucked out of his community of friends and dropped into a new environment where he had to make friends again. So every 2 years, he lost community, so he realized the value of community, but then he learned to rebuild community, okay? So today, as an adult, he really values community. He's very good at building it. When he moves to a new city, he doesn't just join meetup groups, he creates meetup groups, and they become big because he knows how to build community. Technology, personal technology is the love of his life. So things like Fitbits, smartphones, et cetera, et cetera. That's, for him, is the thing he loves. And he, he's one of those people who stood 12 hours outside the Apple store to be one of the first, 500 people or 100 people in the world to get the iPhone 6. That's how much he loves it. And then creative, he's the kind of guy who loves to imagine what can be, to kind of dance around the problem, to co-create with people. He's not this sort of like clean accountant kind of guy, right? Okay, fine. So I met him when he was just about to leave KPMG. He was on his way to Silicon Valley to go do an MBA there. Why? Because his ultimate goal was to build a startup in a disruptive technology. Why? Because a startup is a community of people organized around a common vision. It was going to be in technology because that's the love of his life. And it was going to be, and the disruptive part connects to his creative side. So notice how, as I described to you, Eric, you probably feel like, actually now you really get a feel for the person. And notice how in this description, there's not even one reference to his CV, okay? So a story, remember, does not have to explain everything. It doesn't have to explain your trajectory. It just needs to be something that is meaningful to you, makes sense, and establishes relevance. So that's the second recipe you can consider, the thematic story. Very much like the first, except that instead of like chronological phases, you basically deep dive into themes. All right. Let me share with you a third recipe, which also looks very similar, but again, the stuff in the middle changes. I call it the parallel lives story. You might, for some of you, this could be very interesting. So the parallel lives, the idea is that basically you have two lives. You have kind of like your professional track And then you have this other track, which is extra professional. And it means something. Let me start with some examples, and then I will kind of like generalize from that. These are screenshots of people on some website. They're kind of coaches that help people getting into consulting and into product management. Okay, so these are kind of like mini bios, and as you can see, all these people actually have they're very content-wise credible, right? Ex-McKinsey, GM at Open Door, ex-BCG, ex-Bain, blah blah blah. VP at Y Hotel, etc., etc. But what's the thing that I want to point you to? Notice how for a lot of these people, there's also something else besides the professional stuff. This guy cycled around Japan. She's won multiple tennis championships with her dad. This one made an appearance on Top Chef. This one sailed 6 of the 7 oceans. These are more than just hobbies. These are real passions where these people really invested themselves, and it actually means something. For example, this guy who sailed 6 of 7 oceans. You don't do that without learning a lot about teamwork. You don't do that without learning a lot about leadership, even if you yourself were not the leader on the boat. You don't do that without learning about creative problem solving, because there's always things going wrong when sailing, right? And you need to creative problem solve. You don't do that without learning about resilience, right? So actually all these characteristics, these capabilities, these skills, traits or whatever that you build while sailing oceans, actually they're eminently interesting and transferable to a work environment. Let's look at this Jill Schweitzer woman. Made an appearance on Top Chef. At first you might think, okay, but actually, let's think about it. A chef is somebody who, like a really good chef, is somebody who is able to combine science, like rigorous process, and creativity, design, okay? In order to get to this level, she has to have that kind of skill. And is that relevant in the context of product management? I would say yes, because for example, you need to meet the basic rules of tech, but at the same time, there is this whole more creative, empathetic side of things where you need to sort of like understand, have the pulse or the finger on the pulse of the end user and the end customer. So the point is, these two things on paper might look like they're not connected, but in fact, there's real synergies between the professional track and the extra professional track. And I think that can be a very interesting way of shaping your story. All right, let me share with you recipe number 4. Recipe number 4 is extremely simple. It kind of starts with some kind of an intro, then a proof, then a conclusion. And in the intro, what you do is you introduce 2 strengths of yours. In the proof, you give the proof through a short anecdote and 1 or 2 very quick references to your CV, but just very quick. And then in the conclusion, you end with what brings you to this interview, again, in relationship to the strengths. Let me give you an example. Tell me about yourself. Well, I think that there's 2 things that I think really define who I am and what gives me energy. I love finance and I love helping people, and I think I'm reasonably good at it because I have a good sense of empathy. So maybe just by way of illustration, let me share a short story that happened to me recently. One of my friends was in the process of negotiating to buy a company. And one day he came to me and he said, Nicholas, I think that the seller is trying to kind of manipulate me and screw me on the valuation of the company. So I said, tell me more. And as I was listening to my friend, I realized 2 things. 1, my friend was making actually a real mistake in how to value the company. It wasn't the seller was actually thinking, right, my friend was making a mistake. It had to do with the treatment of off-balance sheet liabilities. Second thing I realized, and this I told my friend, is, hey, you think that the seller is trying to manipulate you, but actually I bet that the seller thinks the same because it turns out he's right about how to value the company. So I suggest you go back to him and kind of like admit your mistake and restart the negotiations from that clean basis. And that's exactly what happened. So as you can see, there's kind of this combination of this synergy between how, on the one hand, my understanding of finance, and on the other hand, this capacity for empathy. And that also helps explain why I was one of the top sellers of heavy industrial equipment at my previous company, because in order to sell that equipment to clients, one, it's really important to understand where they're coming from and what these investments mean to them, especially from a life cycle perspective, life cycle costing. So there's the technical side, and again, the empathy side. Anyway, all this also explains why I'm here to talk to you today about this job in private banking, because I think to be a great advisor to high net worth individuals, you have to really want to help them and have this capacity for understanding their concerns, but at the same time being very credible on the topic of finance. And that's the story. So again, there's kind of like a real sort of red thread that goes across. In every step along the way, there's something about these two characteristics that talk to each other, that creates a consistency all the way through to this last step, the rush of insight that explains why I'm here in this interview. Recipe number 5. This one comes from INSEAD. This is kind of dessert. I really love this one. And I call it the metaphorical anecdote, and you will understand very quickly why that is. So let me tell it to you. So the person said, the interviewer says, "Tell me about yourself," and this is what the person said. They said, "Well, let me tell you a story about my childhood because I think it reveals quite a bit about the kind of person and professional that I am. So when I was young, I once stumbled upon an abandoned, beat-up bicycle. It was really like beat up, on the verge of death, if you will. And somehow I had the inspiration to take it home to bring it back to life. I don't know where it came from, and so I did. I brought it back home, and I spent the next 6 months bringing this bike back to life. And during that time, I did all the things that you can imagine, removing the rust, repainting, changing the tires, changing the chains, etc. It took me a really long time because I really had no idea what I was doing. I made a lot of mistakes and so on and so forth. But in the end, the bike was gorgeous, beautiful, like new, and it became my first bike. Okay, and then a few months later, I stumbled upon another bike like that, abandoned and beat up. So I thought, hey, that was great last time. I want to do it again. So I took it home. I repeated the process. This time I did it much faster because I knew a bit more what I was doing. The result was the same. It was a beautiful bike, except I didn't need it because I already had a bike. So what I did is I sold it and I made my first money. And I thought, oh, wow, this is really cool. So at that point, I started to go look for bikes that were beat up and abandoned so that I could bring them back to life and sell them. And so that's what I did. And as I did this, I made far more money than my friends who just got pocket money from their parents. Occasionally, I would need to buy an expensive piece of equipment to repair a bike, and I didn't have the money to do that. So I would borrow the money from my dad. And then when I'd sell the bike, I'd pay him back. Anyway, the point is, I've been doing private equity since I'm a kid, and now I want to do the real thing. What a nice way to start, huh? What a nice way to start an interview. It doesn't cover the CV at all, but it doesn't have to. It really doesn't have to. It's just a really great, refreshing way of starting that reveals a lot about the person, a lot. Sense of initiative, understands how money works, tells us what he wants to do, and so on. So it really reveals a lot. And in fact, it makes us want to know more. It's a great way to start. So remember, when you're thinking about tell me about yourself, remember what the objectives are: to set the right energy tone, to establish relevance, to trigger interest and curiosity. And don't hesitate to be bold and creative in the way that you do this. The goal is not to give a complete account of your trajectory and explain everything and sell yourself. That's just not helpful. Okay, and the reason that many people fail is because, or fail, like they start in a boring way, is because they start by saying, my name is Nicholas and I was born in Paris and blah, 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 blah. It's all true, but it's just not that exciting. Okay, good. So that was tell me about yourself. Tell me about a time when. For this, we only need one recipe. Thank goodness. So where does this fit in our interview strategy? Here is basically, these are the stories we're going to tell to eventually prove to someone that we have this skill or that skill or this, trait or that trait. And so before I share the recipe with you, let me just kind of like share a bit of set up the scene. I think it's really important to recognize that business is about making change happen. Yeah, that's it. Business is not the only discipline in the world, but business is one of the disciplines in the world where we try to make things better. Maybe we try to make things better for customers, or we try to make things better for our community, or maybe we just try to make things better for the company, but we try to make things better. So it's about making change happen. So if you're going to participate in this, you need to be a change agent. Great stories are the stories that show that you are a great change agent, that you make stuff happen. Okay? So in a sense, the question that interviewers have in their mind is, do you have the propensity to drive change? Can you inspire and guide people to find the right solutions? And do you have the energy and the flair to kind of create, buy-in around you? Okay. One more thing to set the scene. When people tell stories, a lot of what they do is they talk about what they did and what they said. And that's fine. But if you only do that, you miss the opportunity to give the full richness. Great stories also talk about what you thought, the decisions you made, and what you felt. Because now we really see how you operate. You see, what's interesting about a story is not just the result, but also how you got to the result. Because we're not buying the result. If I hire you, I'm not getting the result, like the improvement that you made at your previous organization. I'm not getting that. But what I'm getting is the machine or the person who is capable of producing those results. Good. So let me start with a story of change, and then I will show you the underlying recipe. So the story kind of goes like this. Let's say the question is, tell me about something that you've done that you're proud of, let's say. And so the story might go like this. So I was working in a bank and leading the team that improves the efficiency of the call centers. And the biggest opportunity of the year came when one of my team members found this new employee scheduling software that promised significant savings, while at the same time giving employees more freedom to make their own schedules. So as the team leader, I thought it was my responsibility to try to get the buy-in, to basically help ensure that the relevant committee agrees to adopt this software and make the investment in the software. At the same time, I had never made an investment proposal to such an important group of people. Never. So the question was, how do I do that? So when I reflected on this, I realized that probably the most important and difficult task here would be to get the agreement from the VP of Employee Relations. Why? Because she was really highly, very influential. Her voice counted a lot, but also because she didn't like change. So the question was, how do I get her on board? And I decided to approach this challenge in 2 steps. Number 1, try to really put myself in her shoes. And number 2, engage very closely with her. So when I put myself in her shoes, I really tried to imagine the question from her perspective, the issue from her perspective. And what I realized is that, there would be a lot at stake for her, because preserving employee morale and quality of life is really essential, because the environment in the call centers is really high churn, so that she probably wouldn't want to do anything that she feels could increase churn. And so there was a risk that she would get very nervous with anything that could disrupt, the current situation. And so to address this, I thought it's not going to be enough to just convince her intellectually. She should see for herself how good that's experience for herself, how good that software is. So what I did is I organized basically like a half-day demo, where she would get to experience the software as if she were an employee, and she would see how it actually really makes life better for employees compared to the existing software. So I did that, and she loved it. And so in conclusion, two things happened. This VP became very supportive, which in turn helped to get the whole committee to agree, and to essentially buy and implement the software. And the second thing is I realized that personally, I actually really thrived and enjoyed the challenge of trying to create buy-in in an organizational context. So notice how I actually talked quite a bit about what I thought and the decisions I took here, and not just what I did and what I said, right? But so what's the framework? What is the recipe? It's very similar to STAR, except it's better. It's kind of like STAR on steroids, if you're already familiar with STAR. And it goes like this: context, which is the same as situation; conflict. Conflict is basically when there's something you want, but there's an obstacle standing in the way. Or actually, let's see, there's something you want, but there's an obstacle standing in the way. So you need to jump over that obstacle or go around or something, because that makes it interesting. Choice is about the choices you make in order to confront this obstacle. So it's much more than actions, because choice requires reflection and thought. And then change is the result. And remember, we are trying to show that we're agents of change. So if we think about the story that I just told you, and probably a good way to build the story is start with the end. So in the story I told you, in conclusion, two things happened. The committee voted to buy the software, and personally, I realized how much I thrive on this. A really nice way to talk about the change you've made is to talk about the external change, but also the internal change, how you have grown, or the insight that you got. Okay, so then what do you do? Then go to the conflict part, because it's how you resolve the conflict that leads to the change. So here, as team leader, I wanted to obtain the formal approval, so there's some kind of objective, but there was this obstacle. I'd never done this before. So the conflict is, the way you want to think about this is, I wanted X, but I had to overcome Y in order to get it. When you set it up like this, it makes it interesting, okay? Because it's not obvious that you'll get to the result. So, raise the stakes here. Try to frame the obstacle in such a way that the listener is going to think, oh wow, that's a tough challenge, or oh wow, what a great opportunity, or oh wow, but some kind of oh wow reaction. And then you go into the choice. So what are the things that you did and thought and decided that ultimately resulted in this? And actually, so a really nice sentence to have in there is, so I decided. But I think that a really nice way to structure this part, and by the way, this is where you should spend about 50% of your storytelling time, is kind of using these sequences. First, describe a feeling, then the thought that came as a result of the feeling, then the decision that came as a result of the thought, and ultimately the action that resulted from the decision. And so if you have one or two or three of these sequences in that whole choice part, they're basically the sequences that helped you overcome that obstacle and that resulted in the change. So they're the bridge between the obstacle and the change that you ultimately achieved. Once you've kind of like figured out, okay, yeah, I've got my story, then you just need to like, you know, figure out what is the amount of context that I need to give. And my strong tip here is remove all the stuff that is not necessary. Just keep it as short as possible. Okay. So that's the recipe for how to build one story. And remember, we talked about the fact that you're going to need more stories. But here's something like a mistake that many people make. They think I need to be ready for all the possible questions that could come to me, right? And indeed, there's a lot of questions that could come to you during the interview. And so if you start thinking, I need to be ready for all of this, as you start to prepare for all of this, you're going to start realizing, oh boy, whoops, it's impossible. I can't be ready for all these questions. It's overwhelming, and that's going to hurt your confidence. Yeah. So do not go on websites that tell you the top 50 interview questions and how to get ready for them. These are terrible websites. You know why? Because they make you a victim of the interviewer. Basically, what they're saying is the interviewer could do any of these things to you. They're in control. And now you just need to be as ready as you can. But the thing is, you can't prepare for 50 questions or 100 questions. So what do? Turn it around. Turn around the whole problem. Remember the software story, the one that I just told? Well, actually, I can use that story to answer all these questions. Yeah? It's kind of doing an Aikido move. So what's the implication? Build a portfolio of 7 or 8 stories that you bring with you to the interview. And if you've got that portfolio of 7 or 8 stories, you'll be ready for 80 to 90% of all the questions that could possibly come your way. And for the 10 or 20% for which you really don't have a story, that's okay, because not everything you say has to be amazing. Yeah? But if you have 6 or 7 or 8 great stories, you're in a great place. And there's no question that you have plenty of stories to tell. Yeah, I know some of you might be thinking, I don't have that many stories, but I would say, yes, you do. Yes, you do. If you actually start kind of like really reflecting and looking and kind of going back through your past, you'll realize you have a lot of stories to tell. Maybe they're not all good stories to tell, but you have a lot of stories to tell. So my recommendation for how to build your portfolio is the following. First, make an inventory of the meaningful experiences you've had, not stories, but experiences you've had. And start early, start at age 15, or maybe even earlier. And reflect on those experiences. You know, why was this an important experience for me? Did I learn something? Did I grow? What does it reveal about me? Just reflect. Then choose the experiences that you think are the most relevant for the interview. Then take that experience and craft it into a story using the recipe I shared with you. Because remember, you're not going to tell everything about the experience. You're going to edit it in the form of a story. And lastly, of course, practice your story. And the best way to practice it is orally with other people. So you can get feedback and so on. And that's how you can build your portfolio of stories. So wrap up, and then I'll take a few questions. Make the interview human again. Yeah, away from robots. Don't let it happen to you. Take charge. Best way to take charge, be strategic. Define your objectives along the Mike dimension and build a story-based plan. Tell stories that matter to you so that you come to life and you manage to be yourself, okay? Be bold and creative with your tell me about yourself, because this is the story that matters the most. And if you start off great, your interviewer will love it and you will feel excited and feel strong. Build your portfolio of 7 or 8 change stories and, refine those stories, make them better through practice, not in front of the laptop, but through practice. Yeah. Keep in mind also that actually, I'll just skip this because maybe the most important thing to say here is not everything you say has to be brilliant. Don't put that pressure on yourself. Okay, all you need is just a few great stories that matter to you, and I promise you'll be in a great shape. Know also that have faith that people will like you. People tend to be very harsh critics of themselves, but actually, again, the psychological research has shown the existence of this thing called the liking gap. People actually like you a lot more than you like yourself, right? It's just we tend to be our harshest critics. So be kinder to yourself and relax, yeah? And see if you can let go of that handbrake so that you can show the best of yourself and really shine without selling yourself. Very good. So let me now kind of go into questions. I'm going to try to take them from the top. What's the key information about us and experiences that we need to share in order to be synthetic? I would say relevant experience. Yeah, so relevant experience. The things that you share should be relevant. So it's of course it's because there's an audience in front of you. As per your recommendation, the candidate should wrap up and summarize the interview. What would your approach be to this given the opportunity platform at the end of the interview? So, sometimes the interviewer will kind of make it easy for you to do this. They might say hey, is there anything else you'd like me to say? Or that you'd like to tell me? And at that point, what you might be is actually, I think we covered everything. So actually allow me a minute to kind of try to summarize it for you. Summarize what I've been trying to convey to you. So that's if they do that. But let's say a worse scenario, a tougher scenario, where the interviewer kind of says, okay, looks like, we're done here, or we're out of time. So, we'll be in touch with you. And at that point, you can still say, oh, wow, okay, I didn't realize time had gone by, because I actually really enjoyed it, time flies. If that's okay, I'd just like 1 minute to then just kind of to try to wrap everything up, because I do want to make sure that, I conveyed my messages clearly. And then they're not going to say no, they won't. And so then make it quick, give your 1 minute summary at the end, yeah? So if they don't give you the opportunity, just claim that space. They will be impressed that you did that, because so few other people do that. How do you mix professional stories with emotional stories? Oh man, there's no opposition between professional and emotional. There's so much emotion at work. If you think about it, I mean, people fight at work all the time. People get panicked. People get, frustrated. There's conflicts of ego conflicts, etc. The notion that work is a place without emotion is completely false. So I would not. It's not like there's professional stories and emotional stories. Every professional story has some emotion into it. The question is, do you give yourself the permission to highlight the relevant emotions in there? Any tips about storytelling for people who are naturally shy or get nervous when doing an interview? This is less about the content of the story and more about body language and use of voice. Yes, the best tip is actually to just practice with people. Just practice with people, and ideally, increasingly with people that don't know you or don't know you so well. So that basically you get to a point where it doesn't feel weird to tell your stories to people that don't know you. And then when you get to the interview, the only thing that will be new is the actual individual in front of you, maybe that room, but the whole process of telling your story to someone that you don't know will not be new. So practice. Practice is really the best thing. There's no shortcut here. As we have very little experience, isn't it harder to tell a story? It means you have less content to play with, but you certainly have plenty of content. Can we use extra professional experiences? Absolutely, you can, you should, just make sure it's relevant. I find the strength story comes off as show off. How to showcase your strength without seeming arrogant. So there's just some nice tricks of language you can use to make yourself seem less arrogant. Instead of saying I'm good at something, just say I really enjoy doing this, or you can say I really thrive. You just change a little bit that language and promise you won't, that will solve that problem. I'm just wondering how we can incorporate it specifically as entry-level applicants with little experience. Okay, I'm not sure I get that question. Do you have any recommendations for when applying? They ask for a video of yourself. Yeah, tell a great story and smile while doing it. Or maybe smiling is not the right emotion, but certainly show some emotion. Don't be a robot. Yeah, do it with tell the story with conviction. With conviction. The video doesn't need to be perfect. What matters more than the perfect video is conviction. You know. Will you show the presentation? Yes. Do you recommend a specific personal/professional stories ratio? So again, I don't like to think too much in terms of like this is professional or this is personal. That sometimes it's oversimplistic. I think that everything that you talk about should be relevant. But under the umbrella of everything is relevant, then we can indeed say there are things that happen in the professional sphere and things that happen, let's say, outside the professional sphere. Then my sort of mental model ratio is 70% professional and 30% extra professional. But you know, how do you define the line between professional and non-professional? Let's say you're doing something about like in a student club at the university. Is that professional or non-professional or extra professional? I don't know, but to me, it's probably relevant. Okay, when you talk about personal stories, can sad stories be told? Absolutely, you can tell sad story. Just make sure that the story ends on some level where there's hope. That's it. But of course, sad stories, definitely. Loss of a family member, etc. That absolutely. The only thing is, this is the only thing. If you're going to use a story that is emotionally charged, don't. How to put it? You can share the story that's emotionally charged with the purpose of helping them to appreciate how that's impacted you, but don't make them don't dump that emotional weight on them. So in particular, don't sort of like do things like pausing after I'm just going to use an example just to illustrate, right? So I might say like, one of the things that has, whatever, 6 years ago, my mother died, and this has, really like made me rethink my priorities. So I can do this in two ways. I can say, 6 years ago, my mother died. Pause for dramatic effect. That's a terrible idea, because now you are emotionally manipulating, or they might think you're emotionally manipulating them. So what you want to do is you say, 6 years ago, my mother died, and I'm telling you this because this has profoundly made me rethink my priorities. And there's 3 ways in which my priorities have changed. Number 1, number 2, number 3. That's it. So you don't spend too much time on the sort of mother dying, but you introduce it so that people understand where your new priorities are coming from. It's really important that the interviewer not feel like you might be trying to emotionally manipulate them. Should we transform all of our experience in a positive version of them? Can we talk about bad sides or never? Of course you can talk about bad sides. Stories where you struggled, Stories where you got nervous, stories where you were kind of lost about what to do, all these are great because they humanize you. And I can tell you that there is not a single person in this world who doesn't struggle. So if all your story is about there's no struggle and everything you touch turns into gold, that's not believable. So yes. Is the story I come from nowhere overrated in finance? I don't know that it's, I don't know what the story I come from nowhere means. I don't know that story, but I don't know. And I don't know if there's any kind of link in finance. I honestly, I don't know. What about negative questions such as state your 3 weaknesses? Oh, I love that question. That's such a good question. It's such an opportunity for you. So here's what you do. Choose a real weakness that matters. Don't say like you're bad at making ice cream, because that's not relevant. Choose a real weakness that matters, number 1. 2, make it even worse for yourself. Talk about how this weakness has made things worse for you and people around you. So show some self-awareness about this weakness. 3, now start to make things better. Talk about what you are doing to make that less of a weakness. So for example, you're taking lessons, and talk about what you're doing to kind of protect the environment from your weakness. And if you do this, you will show integrity, self-awareness, courage, and somebody who invests in themselves. We could include experience of teaching as a professor in the university. I don't understand how to deal with a question that we didn't prepare. Keep your smile, and don't try to impress with a question that you didn't prepare. Basically, the questions for which you don't have a ready-made answer, this is where you want to play the risk management role. So kind of like avoid making a mistake instead of trying to impress. Because if you're trying to impress, or let's say, if you're trying to score points with something that you didn't prepare, you're actually taking a big risk. So I think that's the best approach. Very good. Oh, there's more questions. Can we reach out to you on LinkedIn? You can try, but I can't promise that I will answer. Just because I have so much, so many requests, and I do have clients that do pay me, and I need to prioritize them. Is it important to tell only the truth, or your story might be a bit embellished? No, so I think that is your personal choice with your conscience. But for me, there's 2 things. There's the truth of fact, and then there's the truth of meaning. So, truth of fact is kind of like you say, I did X when in fact you didn't. That's just lying on the facts. And then there's the truth of meaning, which is it's kind of like, what does this story represent for you? What does it mean for you when you tell that story? And I think those are 2 different sort of notions of like being true. Both the stories that I told when I applied for EM Lyon are true in the facts, but actually the first one kind of had no meaning, whereas the second one had a real meaning, and that was a meaning that is actually true, because it does. It's like, it is a real reflection of my personality, and who I am. This whole notion about teaching. So, anyway, I'm definitely not encouraging you to tell untruths or to embellish things with alternative facts, as Kelly Conway, I think is her name, Trump's advisor, advocated. I really do not advocate that. I think just for your own long-term good. Very good. Let's see. Is answering I don't know to a question acceptable? Absolutely. I think that is a very good. It's a great answer. I don't know. The only thing is I wouldn't just leave it as I don't know. So if you just say I don't know, then it kind of the message that it sends is you're not really interested in even providing an answer. But if you say, I don't know, and then you can say, but let me try to reflect on this right now. That's cool. You admit that you don't know rather than pretending that you know, but then you stay engaged in the conversation. From your own experience, do you have a number one recommendation for interviews at MBB which many candidates get wrong? No, not really. It's not, MBB candidates don't get turned down because they made this just one mistake. What they get turned down is because they didn't do enough things right. It sounds a bit harsh, but that's kind of true. So you need to do really well in your case interviews. You need to do really well in your fit interviews. Good. I think we're a little bit over time, but I hope that this was helpful, useful to you. I'm going to send the slides right now as soon as we log off, and then they will be made available to you, I'm sure, in a very short while. So happy storytelling and much inspiration and success as you prepare for your interviews.